Welcome back, Fantasy Fiction Fanatics. It's good to see you again. How are you doing today? I'm really excited because today we finally get to start our first writing episode. Sorry it took so long for it to get out, but as you know, I did all the moving and stuff like that, so we're finally starting. And yeah, today's going to be about plot. I thought we'd start with the very basic for our first episode because plot is basically the most basic and essential part of a book, since the whole book must consist of a plot to be in existence. So, before we start, I did want to mention this book right here called The Fantasy Fiction Formula, and it is written by Deborah Chester. And my favorite author of all time, Jim Butcher, his teacher, his fantasy fiction teacher in college was Deborah Chester, and she wrote this book about writing fantasy fiction. And there's even a little foreword by Butcher in there. Let's see if I can find it. Yep, foreword by Jim Butcher. So I really wanted to get this book just because I really love his writing, and this is who he said he learned everything from, and he even wrote the foreword for it. So I would really recommend getting this book. I haven't gone completely through all of it yet, but it is really good so far, and it's given me lots of help and tips and tricks and things like that. I'm not really going to be going off of this book for our lessons and things like that. Maybe occasionally things that I have picked up from this book might occur, and I will try to reference saying that it's from this book whenever I do use some of the ideas that are in this, but I wanted to just kind of do my own thing, not really have a textbook for it. But I do really recommend, if you want to write fantasy fiction, that you check this book out. It's really helpful, has lots of good tips and tricks and exercises for you to work on, and goes through the step-by-step process of everything. If you look at the, let me really quick look at the contents for you. There are 21 chapters, and each chapter has a different topic, obviously, like plot and character design and dialogue and all the different basic points of it, but it's all geared toward specifically fantasy fiction. So I would really recommend looking it up and testing it out and things like that and seeing if it's helpful for you. So, yep, just wanted to mention that. So if you were looking for a book that might help you out, that would be one to look into. Alright, so let's go ahead and start with our discussion of plot. And we're going to start the very, very beginning with the question, what is plot? And I know many of you are probably like, plot is such an obvious question. I already know what plot is. Why do we have to cover it again? All the way back from your very first writing class, we've already discussed what is plot, and that you have already been sick and done with it. But I think that it is a good place to start, because until we truly understand what plot is, we can't understand how to apply it and what kind of things need to be done for writing it. So I know it is a very common thing, and it is done over and over in many classes, and that you probably are sick of hearing about the definition of plot. But let's go ahead and go over it one more time, just so we're all on the same page for our discussion on what my definition of plot is. So, in my experience, plot takes two different, not really roles, but there's two types in a story. We've got the main overarching storyline, which is the main plot. What is the main goal of the story? For example, we're starting to read Dragonlance with our other videos, so let's go ahead and talk about that for a second. We don't know the main plot just yet because we haven't gotten through the whole story. We don't really totally know what the goal is, where they're reaching for. But as we kind of go along, we're starting to see a little bit of we have these good characters and we have these bad characters, the Draconians being the bad characters, and we've got our main characters as the good characters, and we're seeing that they are at odds with each other, and we're talking about the evil in the land and things like that. So we can already see a little bit, at least at this point, that it seems kind of like a good against evil kind of story. And though we don't know exactly what our plot is yet, we can see it probably has something to do with that. Maybe good defeating evil or something of that nature. So you can see a little bit as we're going along through the story that we already have a little bit of an idea of what the plot is for that story. But we don't know what the main goal is. What is the goal? Is it to get rid of evil? Is there going to be something new that comes up? Things like that. So that is the first definition, not really. First notion of plot is the very basic set of what the overarching story is going to be about. What is the main goal of the main characters? Where are we trying to get from the beginning, and where are we getting through to the end? What makes what we're doing there is the plot for the main story. And of course, with plot, it also means going through the obstacles to get to the end point. So A to B, through the obstacles to get there. So that is the main plot that most people think of as what is the overarching storyline. But there is also another type of plot in stories, which are specific events. Each specific event can have a plot. And it's a similar kind of notion where we have, okay, this is the point where we're at the story, how do we get to the next point in the story? So we are then thinking, how do we get to the next item? And that is another part of plot. We've got the overarching one, and then we've got a bunch of these little mini plots that go along throughout the story. And like I said again, the main goal usually has a lot of obstacles that get to it, and those obstacles a lot of times are the specific events and goals of the characters throughout the story. How do we get through these obstacles to continue the plot? That's going to help lead us to these little mini plots in between our big main plot. So now that we've got our very basic idea set down, let's go ahead and talk about the next basic question for plot, and why is plot important? Again, you're probably thinking this is such an obvious answer. This is such an obvious question. We've already been through this, but let's go ahead and discuss it a little bit, because knowing why it's important is the first step to knowing how to create a good one, because unless you know why it's important, you're going to let it fall through the cracks and let it not be as strong as it could be because you don't understand the main importance of it. Okay, so for the reason that it's important is that plot is the essence and the makeup of the story. Without plot, there isn't much of a story. If nothing happens, if nobody goes anywhere, if there's no main reason or little reasons to go anywhere, then we're out of dumb luck. There is no reason to go from one point to the next, and so there is no story. It is the foundation that the story is laid upon. As for the overarching part, one second. Oh, forgive me, thanks. Okay, so as the overarching plot line is the foundation because we've got that main goal to work with. That's the main foundation of the entire book. And then those little sequence of events, the little tiny plots that are inside of the main plot, are important as well, because these are the ones that lead up to the next plot, the next obstacle or the next goal that leads then to this bigger goal. Let me go ahead and discuss that just a little bit. I know we're on to the next question with why it's important, but I think to understand the importance, we need to take a little bit of a step back and let me explain a little bit more about these specific event mini plots. And these plots are important because they are the little tiny reasons that they get to the next step. It's the next point and the next point and the next point that slowly leads up to this big overarching plot development. For example, again, we're going to go back to our Dragonlance example since that's what we've been reading. We've got the first point where everyone in the meets in the inn at the very, very beginning. So that's where we're starting from, is everyone meeting up together. And then we've got where Tasselhoff hits the burning dude that was in the fire and heals him, and now everyone's trying to capture them and the staff. So we've got that plot point where, okay, now we've got the beginning, and we've moved a little bit further, kind of on its own, to everyone chasing them. And that is where our point starts for that plot. We're like, okay, the goal now is to get away from all these people chasing us. It is to get to safety. Okay, they escape to Tika's house, and they think that they're in safety for a while, but that's not going to hold them for much longer. So they're like, okay, now how do we get to a definite point where we're going to be safe? Like, where do we actually need to go? We need to get out of Solus, things like that. So then the next goal is like, okay, let's get out of Solus because now they're chasing us because they know that we're here. Okay, so you would think that then, after they cross the boat and they're at the cave, okay, now they're safe. What is the next goal? Well, they decide that their next goal is going to be to go to Haven, because that was the original plan for both Gold Moon and Riverwind, to find out more about the staff. So everyone's like, okay, we're going to go to Haven. But they get attacked on the road, and so now it's like, okay, what's the next point, and what's the next point? So that's just some beginning examples from the book that we're reading. Is you see this progression of where little goals and what little things are fulfilled, that then at the end, by the time they get to the end, it's going to have gotten this overarching plot goal that, okay, if you look back at the beginning, the whole thing was going toward this. Everything was going toward that, and so forth. So it is important, because we've got this overarching foundation of where we're headed with this book. How do we get from point A to point B is the whole point of the book. Getting to point A to point B. And we've got all the little mini subplots, which are important because they are how the characters are going to get from point A to point B without knowing what point B is supposed to be. Because the characters are just living their lives as far as they know. They aren't saying, hey, how do I get to this ending goal? No, they are like, what is the goal of my life right now because of what's happening in it? Okay, I've achieved this goal, or this goal was interrupted because of this. Now what's the next goal? And what's the next goal? And what's the next goal? And so that is how we progress through the story. So that is why it is important. So we've got a good now definition, at least what I like to consider plot. And its two different functions, as well as why it's important. So hopefully you can kind of see that without a good, strong plot, we have no real way of having a book or even a story, because of the fact that it is the foundation. And that is also why a lot of times there are subplots, and that's kind of like the same thing as the little mini plots, just a little bit more off track of the main goal. So that is also a section that we might cover in the future, but right now I'm just sticking to the main plot and these little mini plots that lead to the main plot. Alright, so let's go ahead and move on to the next topic, which is how to develop plot. We're going to cover it in both the main overarching plot, as well as the basics of like the specific events and that kind of plot building. So the first thing with developing an overarching plot line is to decide what kind of fantasy you're going to be writing. You can either do a high fantasy, which is a complete new and developed fantasy world that you create, or you're going to do an urban fantasy where it takes place in our world, and you are adding fantasy elements to it and kind of changing the history of this world. Because depending on what kind of fantasy world you're going to do, it's going to change what kind of plots are available to you. If you're going to do a whole new fantasy world and very high fantasy stuff, it is not unlikely. I mean, it is not impossible, depending on what kind of story you're doing, what kind of world you created. But it is less likely to have things like guns and big cities that are the same kind as in our world. So those kind of plots that might apply to something that happens in our world would not apply to this fantasy world that you've created. Again, it's not stuck in stone depending on what kind of world you've created. Maybe it is a world that has similar qualities. But more than likely, if you're going to do something something that would happen in our world just with fantasy elements, it's going to be more of the urban fantasy, and that's going to have its own types of things that you are going to have for plots as well. The plot's going to fit what kind of world you've created and what you're doing with that world and what you expect to happen in that world. So first you must decide what kind of genre, what kind of style of the fantasy genre you're doing. High fantasy or urban fantasy. And then from there you have deciding what your plot is going to be. Now for this next kind of development with this plot, I am going to have to give credit to the book I discussed because it kind of got me thinking of this type of notion and this kind of plot development because of reading that book. So if you want to go ahead and see how Deborah talks about it and things like that, I do recommend the plot portion because it is really, really helpful. And so it is a little bit based on this. It's not the exact same, but it is developed because I read this book, so I do want to go ahead and give her credit for that. But the way the plot will be developed for the overarching story is what is the basic notion of your story. That's what you have to start with for this plot. The plot is this goal and what kind of obstacles you're going to have because of the goal. Because obviously there is no storyline, or not a very good story, is what I'm trying to say, if you can get to A to B and there's no problems. You're like, okay, making a very simple, not story-like goal, but like say, you're saying, I'm going to go to the store, and the person can just drive to the store and go shopping. Then there is no real story that's going to be able to have any depth to it or any length to it, or very many people interested because, okay, this person went to the store and they went shopping. What's the big deal? There is no real conflict or any problems that they're facing to get to this goal. And the whole point, a lot of times, of fantasy and many other books is the problems we face toward getting that goal. We want them to reach the goal, but we don't know if they're going to make it. And that's what makes it interesting and fun and us wanting to continue to read more about it. That's why a lot of times there are cliffhangers and chapters that end in bad places, because that way you keep turning the page. So I have some examples here, some more common examples as well as some from our reading of Dragonlance. But I've got these two examples. One, they're both kind of urban fantasies. I didn't really pick a high fantasy one for this one because I wanted to try and make references to books that are well known, so that way most people would be able to catch these examples. But if we go ahead and start with Harry Potter Book 1. Now, there is a difference between an overarching plot between a series of books and an overarching part of one book. So I'm just discussing one book. Book 1's overarching storyline is that Harry wants to go to this wizarding school and get away from the Dursleys and all that and have a good time and be happy at this school. But because of Voldemort and the Sorcerer's Stone, that is interrupting his year and it being a good, easy year to get away from the Dursleys. Okay, another example is Twilight Book 1. Again, like I said, I know these are series, but we're talking about just the one book. What is the point between point A, the first page of the book, to the last page of that particular book? Bella moves to Forks and wants to live an easy life, blending in, not being the center of attention, and just go along, live with Charlie to make her mom happy. But because she falls in love with a vampire and is hunted down, she ends up being hunted down by James and can't just live her easy life blending into the background. So we have that goal in mind, and we've got this reason why it's not happening. And that does not mean that with the overarching plot that B is always going to be exactly what you wanted B to be in the beginning. So in the beginning, Bella's goal is to have an easy life and not blend in. She ends up getting hunted down by James, but that does not mean at B that she has that easy life. And sometimes that is the end goal, and it is reached, and sometimes it's not. But there is always the plan to get there and why it hasn't happened, and then whatever that B ends up being is because of why it didn't happen. Does that make any sense? I know I kind of threw that wrench in there a little bit as we were discussing the plot, kind of also talking about how you don't always get to B. But right now I just wanted to show how we're getting the A to B and why it's not happening throughout the book. And yes, like I said, sometimes we get to the B as originally planned, or sometimes the B ends up getting to the B in a different way than we expected. So in a way, Bella does get to be the easy life that she wanted to, and she does get to end up having the kind of blending into the background, not as much as she originally wanted to, but she ends up getting to that easy life after James is defeated. She goes to prom and does like her normal things just with Edward by her side at that point. So again, let's just do one more recap. We've got A to B and the reason why A cannot just be going to B so easily. What kind of conflict is there going to be for the story, the main portion of the conflict for that story? That is how you must develop your overarching plot. What exactly do you want to have happen? And do you want them to reach point B? Or are they not going to reach point B until the end of a series? So that's why I'm saying with certain books we might not reach the B, or the B might be reached indifferently, because that is the beginning of this story, but it is not the end of the series, which incorporates the bigger story. So you kind of have to pick and choose on what you're going to do. If you do a series, the overarching B might seem like it starts at point A and wants to be at the end of point B, and point B is not reached until later, and maybe it's reached at the end of the story, and you decide to start from a new point A and go to a new point B. It's all up to choice, and we will go ahead and talk about those kind of more developed plot elements at a later date. We'll go ahead and talk about like things like subplots and plots between series and things like that, but I just want us to give it the basic notion of plot right now. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about plot and development of it for the tinier events. The events that lead up to the point B. So these are important because they are the moments that flow together to make the story, like I have mentioned before. And so each event has to have some kind of purpose. So these kind of little tiny plots are important to have a purpose, and so they are built a bit differently. I've got my little notes here that I'm going to go ahead and bring a little bit closer to me just so I don't miss anything I wanted to say to you. So here are my list of the different elements that I believe these little mini plots should either employ or need in them, or most of needs to be in there. Something that these are the important parts of the mini plots, on what purpose they are given and how they help move the overarching plot forward. So each event should have a purpose of some kind, like I had just said. This purpose should move the plot forward. Most of them should move the plot forward. That doesn't mean every single one has to move the main overarching plot forward, but it should be the majority of them should. They should develop characters. Just like when we're reading Dragonlance, most of these little tiny events develop the characters because we see how they react. We see how they deal with stress. They do all these different things that I've talked about in other episodes talking about the book. So most of them should develop the characters. We should also be developing the world, because the only way we can portray the world to our audience, because it is one that is not a normal world that we live in and expect the norms to be that case, each of these events must develop the world as well. That's the way we can portray little by little to the audience what kind of world we're in. We need to flow from one to the next. Let me go ahead and expand on that. We need to have a sense of motivation or reason. Why or how does one event lead to the next? For example, like I was talking about earlier with Dragonlance, the one event with them running away because they were caught with the staff then leads to the fact that they need to escape in the boat, which then leads to them hiding in that cave. And then they all talk and they realize that they need to go ahead and learn more about this staff because the people are after it, so that leads them to the next step and the next event and the next event upon that. They flow together one after another. And then the last one is going to be events can be considered chapters or a section with a break. Now, obviously, not every single section is going to be, every single event is not going to be sectioned off as a section break or at the end of a chapter. For example, some chapters have a couple of events in them, but depending on how you want to break them up or how you want to emphasize certain events, you can do that, either section off with a break or at the end of a chapter. Or if you believe that every single event needs to be framed, depending on how your story is going and how the flow between each one goes to the next one, it might be advantageous to have these chapter breaks. For example, if we go ahead and talk about the Dragonlance one, it seems that a lot of the events, not all of them, but a lot of them do fit kind of in those chapters, or they do sometimes have those section breaks in there to emphasize and frame the different events that they find are the important ones to take into notice. So that was kind of a lot to go ahead and put into this one little section, as that's a lot to be put in there. But this is the each main purpose of events needs to have these kind of elements, because that is the bulk of your story. Each event then leads to the next event and leads to the next event, and that is what your story consists of, is all these events put together to make this one overarching plot, which is why then you must move the plot forward, and you must develop your characters, and you must then develop the world and all these other things, is because these are the actual things that matter. These are the points that your reader will read. Without these events, without it moving the plot along, as well as these other elements, you will never get these other elements, because this is the actual story, is these events put together. If that makes any sense. Go ahead and comment below if you have any questions on what I am discussing right now. I know that I'm still a little bit figuring out how the best way to teach these things are and these ideas are. So any questions, anything that you don't understand, or anything that you want added explanation on, please go ahead and comment down below. Alright, so if we look at how we develop these two different sections of plot, the main overarching plot with deciding exactly what's going to happen, what your A and your B, and what your complication is going to be, and then if you look at how to develop these little mini events that you decide are going to happen that then take you through those obstacles and lead from A to B in your kind of curvy roundabout way from the obstacles, we're going to learn now how to have the elements that then move the plot along. So we've got our development of this and of the overarching plot, and we've got the development of the small parts and what kind of things have to be put into them and how you have to think about for that. Now, what elements are going to make it so you can connect those events, so you can make the events move the plot forward, which is the main thing that most events have to have, which was the first thing I even had mentioned they have to have, is how do we get the plot to move forward, because that is one of the most important things. If it's not moving forward, if we're not getting to point A to point B, we don't have a story. So the first element that moves plot along is also something that you have to have in these different events, which goes toward helping you move the plot along. So all of it you can see already is connected. You have to have character development. Character development actually progresses the plot because it's their next action. Because when you develop your character and you see how they're going to react, or how they're going to what they're going to do based on certain situations, you're moving the plot forward. Okay, this is happening, so this is how the character is going to be, and this is how they're going to react to this situation, and so that is now why we're headed in this direction. They are setting up their own next goals because we are developing who this person is. And in this situation, what do? They say that this is their goal, and that's how they're going to go forward. So, for example, again, I know you're probably sick of the Dragonlance examples, but since we're already reading this, and I know that you have prior examples, prior knowledge of it, it's an easy one for us to go ahead and work with. And in the future, I'll make sure to try and put a little bit more different things as we go, examples as we read different books. But, so for example, we've got them going in that boat to that cave at the beginning, where they then have to decide what they're going to do. Well, Tanis is the leader, so all the group says, hey, Tanis, what are we going to do? And then Tanis, because we are developing him as a leader and as a person who has different knowledge of the world and different things, and he discusses with them, and because we've said, okay, this is who Tanis is, when he's a leader, he has to make the decision for everybody, and once he discusses the different elements and things like that, this is what he decides he's going to do, and they say, hey, we're going to take it to Haven, and we're going to see what this staff is. And we're going to help out Gold Moon and Riverwind. Because he is a person that does help out his friends and even strangers. And he is going to go ahead and take responsibility for the actions that are happening right then. So we've developed him as a character by saying this is how he reacts to the situation. This is who he is as a person. And because this is him as a person, this is our next goal. The next goal is then to get to Haven. Well, they're attacked on the road to Haven. So he's going to be like, okay, what are we going to do? How do we get out of this attack? Okay, everybody, let's go into the woods and head toward Kolonost, which is his hometown, so we can get off the road and get away from these Draconians. So, what does that then happen? Now we're in the woods, and then we go ahead and see the stag, which then develops Strum's character because he is a knight, and so on and so forth, and you can see how it just keeps going down the line. The plot is so wrapped up in the characters and who they are, that then this is how we get to the next point, and the next point, and the next point, and then it's all wrapped up into the next thing, and the next thing. The next way to move the plot is, again, something that's already kind of come up from what I've been saying, is the next step or goal. So we've got our overarching goal from point A to point B, and like I said, we have these little mini goals that are going in, and so the way you can move the plot forward is when you start the next event, we can be like, okay, say with, for example, something that, the next step that comes that's not from a character development, because those happen naturally, so you're moving the plot along, like, okay, well now it's not at a point where we can use character development to move the plot along. But a Force Master is then going to come in and say, hey, you have to get to Zaxxaroth in the next 2 days to receive the most blessed human gift that humankind could ever get. And that is now their next goal and next step. So we've got an external thing coming in and saying, hey, this is what the next goal is going to be, and that moves the plot forward. So again, like I said, with the Force Master coming in and saying, hey, this is your next goal, then we're like, okay, the plot's going to move from them deciding, so a little bit of character development, but they're going to decide whether they're going to go or not. And you as a writer are going to say, hey, what kind of story is it? Do they need to go or not? And that's how they're going to say, okay, we're going to go, or they're going to have a reason that they have to go. And that's going to move the plot forward in that direction. They're going to be like, hey, how do we get to point A to point B? Well, we're going to come in and have this external person come in and be like, hey, this is what must be done, so get off your butt and go. Which then leads us to the characters to having a next step or next goal for themselves. So let's go ahead and recap a little bit of those two things. We've got character development, which is then going to push the plot forward because you have a character who is going to act like so in such situations. That is what leads them to where we want them to be in the next section of the plot. Or maybe not where you want them to be, but that's going to be the obstacle that they have to get around as maybe themselves. Or you can go ahead and have a external character who is not one of the main characters come in and be like, hey, this is what must be done in order to have this happen, and your character is then either going to decide to go or in some reason be forced to go onto that path and move the plot forward. So if you keep these kind of elements in mind, you can easily move the plot forward. What is the next step? What is the next step? What is the next step? Okay, how are we going to get to these next steps? Is it going to be something that is dictated to them, or is it going to be something that they will naturally progress to because of who they are? Now, to go ahead and give you another example from another text, I'm going to do Lord of the Rings, since most people, if they haven't even read the book, they've at least seen the movie. I know not everyone has, but it's another common one that a lot of people have seen and know the plot of. So, for example, we're going to do, I'm going to be able to show you both different kinds of examples of, like, these are the kind that are character motivated, and these kind are examples of ones that are kind of the next goal ones. So first Frodo gets the ring, and it's going to be kind of a next goal one because he is not choosing to go and deliver the ring out of the Shire. He is forced out of the Shire. His goal is to stay alive because he has the ring and he knows the ringmates are going to find him and kill him. So his goal is literally just to stay alive. It's not really about him as a person because most people would decide they want to stay alive. So he's going to go ahead and bring the ring out of the Shire, and he's being forced because he's being chased. So that's more of a next step. What is his next step to stay alive? It's to get the ring away from the Shire. So that's an example of that. And then we've got him, once he's gotten to the elves and things like that, he is watching everyone argue about the ring and how it's corrupting them, and the ring is loving the argument, and they just don't even notice. But Frodo does, and he can't take it anymore. And so because of his personality, because he is a nice hobbit who is willing to take the burden upon himself and choose, he will step up to the plate and say, hey, I will take the ring to Mordor. He steps up and says, I will do this because he feels that it is his responsibility, that nobody else can do it but him, because they're all fighting and arguing and it's corrupting them. And he knows that he is not being affected by it, and that he's already taken it so far that he will then take it the rest of the way, even though he has no idea on how to get there or what he's going to need to do to throw it into the fire. But he, because of his personality, because of who he is, he decides he's willing to take that leap and go ahead and make the journey to the Mordor in order to throw the ring into the fire. So we've got the two different examples. We've got the one that's just purely being forced onto the path, forced away from the Shire, and then once he's here, he believes he's going to be able to just leave all his worries, leave the ring in the elves' possession, and he finds that he can't. So then it comes to his own personality, his own choice as somebody to decide that he is going to step up to the plate and that he's going to take on the responsibility, and that is a choice, and it shows what kind of character he is. It shows that he is willing, even though he is inexperienced and probably scared and disappointed that he can't leave it behind and go back to his normal life. He is willing to do what is right for everybody. Alright, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about is details. Details help the plot so much, because it's the little things that then add up and become big things. And all the details of this, of the little events and the little plots and the little things that happen, build up and build up and build up, and it leads into this bigger overarching plot. It leads to where things are going to go. So details are dropped throughout the story, and they give a meaning to the story. They give meaning to the characters. They give meaning to everything that happens and anything that's in there. And so these details show the significance of what each little section of the plot will lead to the big overarching plot. It makes it worth something. It makes it worth reading. It makes us want to know what happens next. These details are essential to the plot and people being invested into the plot. As well as they give, these details give different shifts to the plot. We've got a one-way street, and then all of a sudden it curves, kind of thing. Like we have something that you think that it's going to be doing this, and then suddenly these little details that either you didn't catch before or that you see starting to accumulate, you understand that actually it's leading here, not here. Or that it has different significance. You thought that this plot was going and taking you in one direction, when really the significance of everything is that it's going in another direction because of these details. So the details are what allows the plot to be recognized, as well as surprising the reader and letting it be where it's going to go. Because without the details and the actual story and the richness, the plot is not as rich. The plot will not be as meaningful. It will not get us from A to B in a manner that anybody cares about. So be specific is the key. Giving hints and openings for future events and for characters to work toward that future is important. We, as a author, you want to feed the line, kind of. You want to be specific enough that you can feed that line. You can give the readers things to think about, things to want to know about, things that are important in order to get from one place to the next. But you also don't want to make it so it's so, and that's where the specific comes from, but you don't want to make it so it's so much information that we overdo it and that it blows apart everything we're trying to build. So, let's see, how do I make a good example for this? For example, with the character development. We want to build the character, but we don't want to build the character too fast. Because if you build them too quickly, we don't have any room to see where they will go to make the next goal. So if you already know everything about this character, we don't need to see that when they get in this other situation that this is how they're going to choose to do it and this is how it's going to move them, because we already know that and we're like, okay, we already know this, blah, blah, blah. It makes it less interesting. We feed it along, and that is what these specific details as you go along, the specificness of it and the slowly adding to it and building of the world and the building of the characters and the deciding where these next goals are and to see how that affects people and things like that. These specific little details that you incorporate as you go along with these different twists and turns are what's really going to build the plot into something rich and to build it into something that is worth getting to. Do we care if you don't know anything about Tanis, but he decides that they're going to go to Haven? No. But if you find that he is the leader of this group, and he has struggled because he's a half-elf, and he does have struggling right now with the people that are in his companionship, like Razlin and Goldmoon and Rivermoon, because they don't trust him, or whatever else it is, then those little details are like, okay, well, how is this going to make it? How are these specific things going to affect him? So we see that plot is really comes all the way down to the very, very little details that you incorporate, because that is how we develop the character, we develop the world, we develop the next goal that this person or people are going to have, which then move us along. So also keep in mind with the little details that these little details are what move the plot along as well. Another thing about that is foreshadowing and reading between the lines. The little details will let the reader know that something bad might be happening. It gives them a chance to have a look at the plot before we get there. And that is very important to keep in mind as a reader as well as a writer. What little hints are you going to drop about what's going to happen? You have to kind of know where you're going from that A to B point, and a little bit of those specific plot points and events that you want to have, so that way you can leave these little breadcrumbs behind, these little details, these foreshadowings, these ideas of what's going to happen later, to get the richness of the plot, to make people care about the plot, and to make it worth reading and to give excitement later on. Alright, I know the details were kind of tacked on last minute, and I'll admit, full disclosure, I'm not 100% blown it out in my mind. I just knew it was important, so I might not have explained it as well. So I will try to come back to this in a later episode. But if you have any questions or comments or concerns about it now, go ahead and leave them in the comment box below, and I'll be happy to think about your questions and answer you and try and get a little bit more detailed. And like I said, I will try to definitely come back and make it so it's not quite just tagged on to the end of my discussion, and kind of blow it out a little bit more. We will probably have an episode later that talks a lot more about details and their importance and how they work and how to add them in and everything like that too. So go ahead and stay tuned for that whenever I get a chance to put that one out. So yeah, I think that's going to be the end of the episode for today. I know it's a little bit of a shorter episode, but let me know if you have any questions about plot in general or anything else that I have discussed, or if you have any of your own opinions on the topic as well. I'd be happy to learn from you and to see what you think. If anyone has checked out this book by Deborah Chester, go ahead and let me know. I'd be happy to see how she has helped you and what kind of things you've got from her book and things like that. Now, before we finish, I do kind of want to give you a little bit of homework, just since we're talking about writing. It's kind of hard with me just jabbering at you about the concepts and things like that without you actually applying them and things like that, especially with not actually being in a complete class setting where I can't, give as many in-class assignments or to show physical work and things like that and have more in-depth examples and things like that. So I thought it'd be kind of cool for these videos to give you a little bit of a assignment or whatever, just for you to apply the topics that I've been talking about and see how they work for you and don't work for you. Maybe it will help you know questions that you want to ask or anything like that. So for this class, I'd like to assign that afterward or sometime in the near future, you go ahead and look at some of your writing and look at some of your specific events. And with those events, I want you to see if you can check mark the different things that we talked about should be in those events to help with the plot. See if you can identify maybe some character development that moves it forward, or that it's even moving forward at all, it's moving to the next thing. If there's a goal that's supposed to be reached for the next, if it's setting up for the next goal and working toward the goal that was previously set, or for there to be world developing and things like that. So go ahead and just look through something that you've already written, or if you want, you can start from scratch and write something new and try and see if you can put those elements in and just see if it helps and if you feel like it helps you move the plot forward from that scene. Alright, thanks very much, and again, let me know on that assignment if it helps you or anything else, if you found it educational. I'd be happy to know. And I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll see you later. Bye.